afternoon, everyone. I'm Ann Artis. I'm director of the College of Arts and Sciences Interdisciplinary Humanities Research Center, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the last set of events in this year's Public Humanities and Digital World lecture and workshop series. This series is hosted by the Humanities Research Center's DH Working Group in partnership with the University of Delaware Library, IT Academic Technology Services, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the Department of English. So I begin simply by acknowledging and thanking all of our co-sponsors. Today's speaker, Professor Laura McGrane, is the Koshland Director of the Hurford, double names, lots of money from acronyms,
yeah.
Hurford Center for the Arts and Humanities at Haverford College, and she's founder of the Tri-College Digital Humanities Initiative. Trico DH, their shorthand for this initiative, is a research and teaching collaboration supported by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, involving faculty at Bryn Mawr, Haverford, and Swarthmore, who are committed to media change in a liberal arts context. I'm just stealing language from the website. Professor McGrane will be talking today about some of the structures and the current activities of Trico DH. But before I mention the updated title of her talk today, let me tell you a little bit more about her background and scholarly and teaching interests. Professor McGrane received her PhD from Stanford University, and she teaches 18th century print culture and digital media at Haverford, integrating theoretical work on interface and coding into scholarship on the history of the book. She's published extensively on 18th century print and performance, and she has led Mellon-funded workshops on the Humanities Lab, most recently, that was 2014, and the new Digital Archivism, 2009. She's a co-advisor for Rehumanities, a national undergraduate conference on the digital humanities, which some of you might already be familiar with, I hope. And she serves on the editorial board of 18th Century Connect, a very important peer-reviewed digital research portal for primary and secondary sources in 18th century studies. Is it Koshland or Koshland?
Koshland.
Koshland, director of the Hurford Center. Professor McGrane oversees the Haverford Cantor Fitzgerald Gallery Program and Mellon Creative Residencies Initiative, as well as all of the center's regular programming. She was just telling me on the way over that they have a very robust funding scheme for a lot of programming. I'm jealous of your annual budget. As a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford, she conducted research at the University of Western Cape, and she continues to teach courses on the literature and politics of South Africa quite regularly at Haverford. She also currently serves as the District 4, and yes, guys, we're actually part of District 4, which is Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Delaware. Rhodes, she's the District 4 Rhodes Secretary. So in that capacity, she's a regular speaker and organizer on issues of digital humanities in liberal arts education. The title of Professor McGrane's talk today is The Undergraduate Reader as Maker. So please join me in welcoming her to the University of Delaware.
I'm just finishing my water. Thank you. I will be touching on different aspects of the Trico Digital Humanities Initiative and some of the other administrative work I do, but I'm going to begin with just some broader comments on the digital humanities and undergraduates. I'm thrilled to see all of you here, so I hope we can have a robust question and answer. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a class I've taught recently and some of the work and outcomes in that class. It was the first time teaching it as well, so that's always a little bit of an adventure. I begin this afternoon with a very basic example, but one that has had an impact on how I read the challenges facing the undergraduate scholar and his or her professors in the current educational climate. A student emailed me a couple of years back about a great manual, a brief and witty text that has become a mainstay of teaching website design. Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think. In response to the question, what's the most important thing I should do if I want to make sure my website works? Krug replies emphatically, "Don't make me think." I present two illustrations from the text. They're a little bit blurry, but you'll get the idea of it. The user of the first, and that's actually the second. Let's start with the first. This is the successful site. The good version is not thinking. So I just want to point to this. So, oh, these are today's specials. Oh, I like the product categories. Memories, there it is. Click, no thought, right? Important. The second poorly made site, however, what one might call the thinking man's site, induces questions in the subject. The horror. Where should I start? Why did they call it that? Can I click on that? Why did they put that here? Is that the navigation? Those two things, links look the same. Are they really? The horror, right? A reader interrogating the interface, the semantic content, and even the order he or she should engage the page. Now, this is an extreme example, but the work of usability specialist Jakob Nielsen supports ease of use theory with his focus on eliminating both difficulty and overwhelming content. What is good for the designer, we might conclude, is not necessarily a productive model for answering the question, quote, "What's the most important thing I should do, or you should do, if I want to read deeply, widely, and intentionally, and teach those habits to my undergraduates, or learn those habits as undergraduates?" In her most recent work, Catherine Hales seeks the sweet spot between such productive models of readership, digital technologies, and their relation to embodied selfhood. In How We Think, Digital Media and Contemporary Technogenesis, she argues that models of hyperreading and computer reading enhance rather than deaden and destroy the practices of close reading that have long defined literary studies in the undergraduate classroom. And just to gloss, hyperreading is what we do when we follow, you want to tell us, hyperreading? Hyperreading is what we do when we follow links, read distractedly across digital pages from Facebook to Twitter. Computer reading, differently, involves the deeper algorithmic functions that allow for keyword searches, pattern exploration, what we might call data mining, right? So Hales promotes hybrid reading structures, assignments and projects that allow students to engage texts in the social media and contexts and rhythms with which they are familiar, but also the slower, closer, and attentive spaces that require a different practice. And this is her definition of literacy studies. Literacy studies teaches literacies across a range of media forms, including print and digital, and focuses on interpretation and analysis of patterns, meaning, and context through close, hyper, and machine reading practices. Assignments across media forms, she argues, should teach responsible and creative hyperreading that integrates analysis and digital technology to meet our students in what she refers to as that ever important zone of proximal development. Now, our students at Haverford, Bryn Mawr, and Swarthmore, and I assume many of you too, are becoming ever more skilled in summer library projects, in partnerships with research universities, in technology firms, even in faculty-run digital archive projects, skilled in using tools that invite them to read, write, and create across various disciplines and information domains. But in conversations about technology, as it is currently used in many undergraduate classrooms across the country, something else kind of funny can happen too. The more slick and user-friendly the tools, the less visible the structures, assumptions, and filters that undergird them. And here are some of those tools. We work with mapping programs, text mining, data mining, I have students working on Whisper right now. Some of you may know more about that than I do. And word clouds, right? Thinking through frequency. The prettier the interface, sometimes the more limited our and our undergraduates' understanding of what is at stake in the actual use of a specific technology. And those who make these tools, even scholars, maybe even working in our midst, often intentionally design the software to turn the student, and let's be honest, often the instructor too, into a mere user. Make it easy. Don't make me think. For the purposes of this conversation about reading and making, reading as making, making readers, and reading making, I'd like us to think about this as a user paradox, perhaps even a user-friendly paradox. The very technologies that we use to teach innovative forms of reading and analysis risk dumbing down our sensitivities as we forego interrogation of form, content, ownership, authorship, and information filtering. When used to their full effect, however, and when we teach technology while teaching with it, we are perhaps best positioned to encourage productive student advocates for ethical technologies, rather than mere students produced by an instrumentalizing social machine. So I begin with an anecdote. A couple summers back, I joined the Digital Humanities Summer Institute at Victoria University, and maybe some of you have participated. It's amazing. The week-long grouping of courses and workshops trains scholars, computer scientists, and pedagogues in the latest technologies and coding opportunities, from updates to the Textual Encoding Initiative to web design to tools for literary analysis. We were asked in our sessions to try out various tools, first in the context of our own research as faculty, our ability to integrate these tools with primary texts, to see and approve choices about metadata, and to articulate the original projects we could imagine as scholars and faculty coming from that work. Then they asked about use with undergraduates. Here, the question was simply, how easy is it for students to navigate the instructions? That is, how easy is it for students to be users? Now, having worked with technology in the classroom for a number of years and even plugging in my computer today, I've experienced the agonizing glitches that come with the territory. So this is not a plea for unfriendly technology per se. Right now we use Moodle courseware. I don't know what you use, but it doesn't bring me great joy necessarily. No, this observation and concern reside at the level of how the profession, how granting agencies, how software makers, and how faculty themselves perceive the undergraduate's relationship to digital technologies. Lawrence Lessig pleads with the reader in Code 2.0 to, quote, learn at least enough to see that technology is plastic, that it can be remade to do things differently, end of quote. I would request in turn that those making decisions about classroom technology for undergraduates begin with the goal of encouraging students to be involved in these acts of remediation, to be literate in the very structures and interfaces of our digital prosthetics, and to engage in their deconstruction. Now, I use the terms remediation and deconstruction to emphasize what I see as the lack of creative authorship that we often grant the undergraduate vis-a-vis classroom technologies. Steve Ramsey created a stir in digital humanities circles by demanding that we all be makers, as he calls it. But even his polemic was not extended to the undergraduates who use the tools that we make. In general, undergrads have not been invited to the table as co-participants in the conversations about how tools are made, which are purchased by colleges and universities, and what the implications of those structures are on the student as user. A piece from the National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education, Nightly, reports a reluctance to think about undergraduates as makers at the highest level of funding. There is, and this is a quote from that report, a hesitation on the part of granting agencies to fund projects that rely on undergraduate work, end of quote. And I'm going to repeat that. A hesitation on the part of granting agencies to fund projects that rely on undergraduate work. So, the NEH will fund the making of fabulous databases that students as users can access, but the undergraduate as scholar and maker in her own right is not on their radar. Now, perhaps we should not be surprised by the unwillingness to view students as collaborators, given the disinclination of many humanists historically to engage with undergraduates in scholarly production. We might also ask ourselves, what's so wrong with letting our students, and you guys might be asking this, simply use technology, right? Why is the student as mere user such a bad model for the reading or writing classroom? My point is that in focusing on using technologies to teach close, distant, and hyper reading, and in focusing our attentions on the tensions or sympathies between these different models, some of us may lose the opportunity to explore alongside our students the digital structures that construct all of our reading experiences. The critic Wendy Chun is especially interesting on the problematic of software interface. And note, she's careful not to dismiss the importance of software. One of its key values, she points out, has been to allow more of us to be users than the sophisticated programmers of Unix days of yore. But she also reminds us not to forget what, quote, the screen screens, that the emergence of user-friendly interfaces as a form of computer liberation seems dubious at best and obfuscatory at worst, end of quote. A political science professor, friend of mine, recently described his frustration using GIS mapping software with his students. This is a quote. I write things down, so be careful. We spend so much time learning to use the software that we don't have the opportunity to think about how to interpret the maps that we produce. The idea that he might take that analysis even one step further to press students to understand how the particular GIS software has been produced, who has purchased it, and what its infrastructure both restricts and enables was simply beyond the limits of his class time with a large group. Students also echo this sentiment. In a seminar with the Teaching and Learning Institute at Bryn Mawr College that I attended, one student noted that Facebook was her blog of choice for classes because it was so easy to link to articles. You could just press the F and they were there. So how that single-click simplicity translates to a critical conversation about reading and analyzing those links in one interface versus another was not yet apparent to her as a student. So what if the clunkier, anti-intuitive software encouraged students and us to think more about technology because it's poorly designed? Alan Liu has written extensively on the genealogy of these user-friendly imperatives in his study, The Laws of Cool. He notes that the term user-friendly arose in corporate settings and is in part a, quote, post-industrial efficiency concept, end of quote. He urges us to remember that the term user-friendly, quote, requires an explanation that goes well beyond ease of use to the cultural conditions of possibility underlying the need to design ease of use into technological rationality. What does this mean? These cultural conditions, which Liu traces to a multitasking and networked corporate mentality, may have unintended effects for our classrooms if we don't help students, ourselves, and our institutions to think more critically about how digital technologies use us too. One response to the corporate is to incorporate more open source software into our pedagogies. But even that term open source software is somewhat misleading. In his work on interface, Andrew Galloway points out that open source, quote, really means one thing today. It means open interfaces. It means the freedom to connect to technical images. Let us not be fooled. Open source does not mean the unvarnished truth, but rather a specific communicative artifice like any other, end of quote. So the forces and biases that position the student as unthinking user, even as we are using technologies with learning outcomes in mind, I think are threefold. And it's actually much broader than that, but I'm going to choose three for right now. One, both open source and corporate designers of analytic digital tools, databases, social media, depend on ease of use to increase profit, productivity, and popularity. Two, scholarly designers of analytic digital tools, databases, and social media, as well as the funding organizations that support us, have tended to label undergraduates as users rather than collaborators in the process of making. Even as faculty recognize that undergraduates should be, and probably are often, full participants in facets of the conversation. Three, faculty and higher education institutions more broadly concerned with ease of use, especially in scaled up settings, large lecture halls, heavy teaching responsibilities, often teach students to read and process material with digital technology rather than taking the steps back and back and back to look inside the black box. Who created it, how it works, and how it works on all of us. So, how do we encourage intentional and critical practices of student making that encourage our undergraduates to be less friendly users but extremely intelligent readers? And how does reading the making process, in turn, shape our students to be those writers and scholars who can work analytically and creatively across various reading platforms? So I'd like to tease out these questions using the example of a collaborative course I taught for the first time this last semester. And then I'm going to close after that with some of the work of our Trico, Haverford, Bryn Mawr, and Swarthmore Digital Humanities Initiative, focusing sort of specifically on the student components of that. By the way, this is Tristram Shandy in Wordle mode, for those of you who are wondering. My son recently introduced me to something called Taxido or Tagsedo. Have any of you come across this? It allows you to do the word cloud in various animal forms, like cats and turtles and things. And he's just excited, and I said, but how does it work? What's the algorithm? And he just looks at me like, Mom, it's just cool, come on. Anyway, so this is the course. News Media and Print Culture, a study of 18th century print production and readership in relation to contemporary theories of digital interface. Many of you, or at least some of you, will recognize the early modern and 18th century components of this course within the print history and material book genres that we've taught for decades, right? We begin with Milton's Areopagitica, we move through Swift, Defoe, Fielding, and Heywood, to name just a few of the authors, while covering the theoretical groundwork of Eisenstein, Rancière, Johns. These are all people who write about the material history of the book. The primary text reading culminates in an intensive journey through Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy. Now, while all of that work remains in the course then contextualizes that work within contemporary questions of digital interface, making, coding, social media, and what we call embodied technologies. Roger Chartier argues eloquently in his very new book, which is great, The Author's Hand and the Printer's Mind, and this is from his text. In the digital realm, it is not the written object that is folded, as in the case with the manuscript or the printed page, but the text itself. This means that reading consists in unfolding that mobile and infinite textuality. Reading of that sort brings to the screen ephemeral, multiple, and individual textual units brought together by the will of the reader that cannot be defined once and for all as pages. End of quote. Now, unfolding mobile technology and textuality is really rich in its figurative implications. But I'm curious about the will that Chartier assumes here, this language of the reader bringing this together by our will. Does will demand explicit knowledge, sophistication, intentionality, self-awareness about how text and interpretation are unfolded in multiple structures of power, labor, ownership, editing, and design? To bring ourselves and our students into critical conversations about these issues is to ensure that they have the capacity to engage technology and text in creative practice. So I took a course that I taught before, contextualized it as I described, and here are some of the critical components. The course moves not quite from reading to design, but reading through design and thinking about questions of design. The course moves from ideas about using texts and reading texts to actually making texts. And I'll talk about the various forms of making that we integrated into the class. And the kind of work that we did moved from a kind of isolated classroom into various kinds of publics that allowed the students' work and the conversations to reach quite dramatically outside of our individual classroom space. Now, as I said before, one of the key components of any kind of digital humanities work is work that is no longer done in solitude. We don't get to sit in our caves anymore. So it requires various structures of collaboration. And here, for this particular course, I worked with a digital humanities liaison. So this is a woman named Jen Rachel, who used to be a student, who then went on to become the associate director of our Trico Digital Humanities Initiative. And she actually sat in on the course with me, and we co-created various components of that. So she was a very critical presence to this work. We also worked with this course in partnership with a program, I won't go into great detail about it, though we can talk later, called our Mellon Creative Artist Residency that brings artists to the Trico across the curriculum. So they're there not to hang out in the fine arts departments, though they can be there, but you have to sort of be in dance and physics, or in this case, sculpture, English, writing, and another English program at Bryn Mawr as well. And then finally, of course, we needed to really work closely with our IT staff and our libraries in terms of special collections and various other just areas of expertise, which I'll talk about too. So in each of these cases, we worked with, and this is Jen, the Haverford Cantor Fitzgerald Gallery, and then our Trico libraries and Trico IT. So I'm just going to talk about 4 components of the class. I'm not going to walk you through the full syllabus, but we sort of organized the class around these concepts of grasp, sculpt, code, and interface. And I just want to talk about some of these projects. The first, grasp, allowed us to work with our rare books librarians, and this was our librarians both at Haverford and at Bryn Mawr, to bring copies of all of the texts that we had read in various forms in the classroom. And we set them up, and we had an evening where the students worked with partnered texts, a version of the text on an iPad, and a version of the text in its rare book form. We then, through that work, we coordinated a number of questions for students to think about, some of them tied to touch, the kind of haptic experience of the text, some of them tied to questions about production. So we'd been reading a lot about like who owned Areopagitica in the 18th century. Did Milton own it? Did the editors own it? All of those questions. How do those questions of ownership and labor flip when you start to think about the iPad, right? Who owns that? Who owns the texts on that? Where was that made? How do we start to think about materiality in all of those important and complex ways? How does interface function as one is, yes, moving across a page, in a coordinated horizontal fashion versus the other? So you can kind of imagine the questions that came up that really allowed us to take the specificities of all of the work that we had already done within 18th century print culture to try to think about those same questions of labor and production and reading practices and copyright and ownership alongside these contemporary devices that we often just use as a great device in the classroom rather than trying to look into the device as well. So in this class, we teamed up with Brian Detmer, who is a national book sculptor. He's shown at the Smithsonian. And we were reading Tristram Shandy, and he came and joined our class in those conversations as we were reading Tristram Shandy. He then carved Tristram Shandy. So this is a 1926 edition of Tristram Shandy, and he bought 2 copies of it. He always buys 2 copies of text so that students were able to sort of look through the text, but then watch him as he did his work to seal the text and dig into the text in those ways. And we had a number of conversations about this as a form of interpretive reading alongside the work that they were doing. At the same time, we had in the gallery a larger show of Brian's works called Elemental that was thinking through, it was a traveling show, thinking through a kind of move between digital and material culture. And students were invited in that context to remediate Brian's work as well. So what they've done here, and I won't go into all of this, is sort of work with images from Brian's gallery and images from the various texts that we read to create sort of montage work to think through these various questions. And I can't really read too much of this. This one was addition, subtraction, and the do-over. And one of the questions was, what happens when Brian Detmer makes a mistake with his knife, digging? What happens when the student who's doing this work with Photoshop makes a mistake in terms of the various kinds of layerings and constructions of depth in that work? And how do we begin to think about creativity and failure in those various models as well? So another component of the class was coding, and I don't know how much any of you do any kind of coding, but it's that stuff that you see on the screen and you have no idea what any of it really means, right? Kind of behind the scenes. So with Jen's help, and Jen was funded to go to Brown. Brown has now moved to Northeastern to work with the TEI Women's Project, and I've worked with them as well, to think through what it would mean to code small bits of Tristram Shandy. Now, in the work that we did, we used this thing called the TEI. There was a long conversation. Do you give students specific elements so that they're just learning the mechanics of coding, or do you set them loose and see what they do? We set them loose. There was much frustration, but I'd like to show you some of the results. There were 5 different versions. They worked in groups. And this particular coding of one very small passage, the students entitled Sonic Laughter and Audible Play. And this is just their own, all of the work that they do includes reflections methodologies as well to try to translate it for all of us. So sonic laughter and audible play. We found ourselves attempting to code the sonic elements of Tristram Shandy, highlighting the volumes, rhythms, and effects of the colloquial speech. We had to download a new schema, new interpretive capacity in order for Oxygen, which is the interface that you use to mark things up, to read our markup. So one of the things they discovered was that Oxygen didn't have everything they needed, so they needed to add their own language to that. This revisionary moment speaks to the ways in which technologies require knowledge of interpretive tools in order for us to perform interpretive labor. So there are 5 more of these. I'll talk a little bit more about some of this work tomorrow in the workshop that we're doing as well. And then finally, interface. For the final projects in the course, the students could write a conventional traditional paper, as some of them did, or they could really try to take the work on interface that they'd been doing to think through questions of media and remediating the 18th century. Now I know a number, maybe not you, but a number of people sort of stand back in horror and say, oh, the paper, where's the paper? So I still demand a pretty hefty methodology that comes along with this and a very theorized approach to the work. So in this case, the student created through Twitter the Battle of the Books. And she tweeted the Battle of the Books through she had actually three different, I won't go into all of the details, but there were 3 separate accounts so people could tweet from various areas. She used materials from the library, from digital databases as well. But I want to read to you because I think this is what's important. The name of the project was On Tweeting Ruin. And those of us who know Battle of the Books know that it's a fragmentary text as well as a kind of mock epic. One of the first tweets you see on the homepage mirrors an apology that a news network would share after experiencing an issue that interrupted the narration of an event. The familiarity of Swift News Network's statement serves as a reminder that digital publishing platforms, not just manuscripts, can be damaged. And so she then used this to start thinking through in a more theoretical way how one sort of theorizes damage within these various kind of technological platforms as well. This one, and I am bringing this tomorrow too, for those of you who have played Apples to Apples or Cards Against Humanity, any of you done that? Okay, so this is a student who, go back to this, who's heading off, he's a sociology and English double major who's heading off to law school. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of his work. So having moved through Tristram Shandy, he created his game Tristram's to Shandy's out of this. And it's a game where there's basically an open kind of statement, and then on white cards, there are many responses from the text that you can put into that. But this is the work that he's thinking through Player's Choice. I took as my model the game format of Apples to Apples and Cards Against Humanity. The random and shifting gameplay offered by the mixing and matching of cards allows us to measure the narrator's order against readerly choice, given that the players of the game get to decide which cards best fit which prompts. But he also went on to recognize that while on the one hand, a scholar like his professor in the classroom might just be annoyed with this game because it created random outcomes, that my knowledge of random outcomes is only my knowledge of that because of my familiarity with the text. And so then he wanted to start theorizing how that familiarity with the text and how that kind of precedent text shapes the kind of language of play and our capacity as players in various realms as well. Again, I'm kind of moving quickly here. And then the final was one of our traditional papers. And I want to point out that the work on design and interface also shapes the way that students think about archival and rare books work as well. So this is a student who worked on the letters of Abigail Adams and James Lavelle around Tristram Shandy, and he pulled 3 or 4 documents. The essay reads Lavelle as mimicking the desiring Shandian narrative voice, while Adams asserts herself as an active reader. Elusive acts that are themselves archives of a particular mode of reading made possible in the early Republic by Tristram Shandy. So, okay, so some of the outcomes of this work are that the kind of work that the students did is work that they can actually show publicly, think about, and share. And there was a very large display at the end of this class that included work from a sculpture class, work from this class, and Brian Detmer's unveiling of his text of Tristram Shandy as well. And by the way, for those of you who know the Shandy Trust, they got word of this, and he's now going to the Shandy Trust to do a 2-week residence with them, and he's creating a Tristram Shandy for them. And he points out that he hadn't heard of Tristram Shandy before coming to Haverford, so we're excited about that. But sort of this idea of the public humanities, it really gets our students into primary source scholarship. So they're actually digging, and I'll talk again more about this tomorrow as well, they're digging into the archives, but they're digging into the archives off the syllabus as well, and discovering their own new work around that. It allows students to start thinking through media studies and code literacy, and what I would say for all of us at a more administrative level who are constantly thinking about information literacy, These are the kinds of literacies that the humanities can do really well, again, in a way that is scholarly and intellectual and not just instrumentalizing as well. All right, so what I'd like to do for the last, I'm sorry, I will be very quick with this, but the last bit of this is just talk a little bit about the Trico Digital Humanities and how it builds on this work and how this work builds on that as well. So the 3 colleges involved are Bryn Mawr, Haverford, and Swarthmore. We have a long historical relationship that I won't bore you with right now. You can imagine all of the aspects of that. This was a 3-year initiative funded at $340,000 by Mellon. It's across the 3 campuses. We have a rotating directorship. Associate Director Jen Rachel has taken us through the years, and there's a steering committee that participates across faculty and Trico libraries. And I know that in the introduction there was mention of faculty across the institutions, but it's really critical to recognize that any successful version of this is about McGill libraries, Bryn Mawr libraries, Swarthmore libraries, IT on all 3 of those campuses, faculty and students as well. And those collaborations again and again and again are the critical aspects of all of this work. So we have a number of initiatives, faculty, staff, students, curricular and co-curricular, and I'm just going to focus on some of the student initiatives at this point. So we have research fellowships, internships, and training. Some of our students, so this is just an example of a few of the projects from last summer and this summer. And the work that we do is both work to situate our students with faculty at our institutions who are working on digital projects and faculty at various R1 institutions who are actually quite interested in working with semi-tech literate undergrads who can really help with some of the intellectual work, but the idea for us is that they come back to us then and bring back the knowledge structures to us as well. So here are 3 of the projects coming up. One with a Swarthmore faculty member curating work from the antebellum period. Another student who will be working at the Viral Text Project at Northeastern University Lab, where Ryan Cordell, who probably any of you who are working on DH know his work. This is the first year we've partnered with Northeastern, and we're really quite excited about that. And then Philip Liu, who has worked with Rich Friedman, who's a Haverford faculty member on a sort of early modern music archive that has received over $1 million of funding ultimately from the NEH, which started as a very small ODH grant. So this is another conversation and maybe one that you've already had with other visitors, but there are all sorts of models of scaffolding, small projects that can move to much bigger projects and create those kinds of collaborations as well. But I just want to point to the fact that all of these students are doing kind of real engaged research and intellectual work in these projects. Then the other component of this, which we've been most excited about, and Anne mentioned, is Rehumanities. We've just finished Rehumanities 14. There were 26 undergraduates from across the country. I won't list all of the institutions, but there were 13 institutions that include universities like Yale and Dartmouth, and also Scripps and Pomona, and also a number of, I'm not sure if it was the University of Minnesota, but we take all, and we're actually hoping that some Canadians come next year. So you guys are just down the road, so we would love to see you. So this is a National Digital Humanities Research Symposium for, by, and with undergraduates, and it's the only one of its kind in the country right now. The work of this, and this is just from one student, Sierra Eckert, in a conference like Rehum, a young undergraduate presenter is on the stage with individuals who are experts in the field. This year, Mary Flanagan and Adeline Coe were our 2 keynote speakers, but the students invited those speakers, the students chose those speakers, the students chose the theme for the event, the students created the call for papers, they read through the 70+ applications from students across the country. So while we're there to advise, we're really behind the scenes in all of this. And having that bar raised actually produces really incredible things, and the work is very incredible. And just to think a little bit about the kind of pathways then that can come out of this, we have a student who's now graduating who started working with Rehumanities as a sophomore. She then worked as a fellow with Electric Literature, came back then to the college. She was one of the leading organizers of Rehum, but also became a Haystack Fellow. And I don't know if any of your undergrads are working with Haystack, but Haystack is really excited about these kinds of partnerings. And so while on the one hand, I'm annoyed with certain kind of funding institution sort of spaces that don't get it, there are spaces that are starting to get it or just need to learn to get it. So what does it mean to take an undergraduate in the humanities with you to a conference that hasn't had an undergraduate speak there before. I've done it now a couple of times, and usually it's like, oh, this is kind of a cool idea, because scientists do this all the time, all the time. So part of it is us pushing those boundaries as well. And so she just ran Rehum and was a presenter in that as well. This is Sierra Eckert, worked with Rehumanities, has worked extensively with Rachel Burma, who is creating an early novels database through Penn and Swarthmore. I was mentioning to Anne that this work allows them to take all of these early novels, but to categorize them based on data and categories from the 18th century, not kind of the contemporary categories that we often throw at these sorts of things. And then she's finishing up her thesis work. So to end now, but open this up to question and answer, is kind of the key components of all of this work with undergrads is to engage with faculty, students, and staff to position our work in visible ways, to demand critical acumen about the digital tools we use, and to encourage DH scholars and funders to take undergraduates seriously as makers, scholars, and collaborators. So I think that undergraduate-focused research institutions like the University of Delaware, and again, I'm looking at this crowd over here, just that you're here, and like liberal arts colleges like the Trico, are in a unique position to turn the risk of technology overtaking us into an opportunity to do what we do so well, with our students at the center of our philosophy. As we teach in our various subject areas through technology, we can at the same time ensure that students begin to look at, rather than through, those technologies, even the ones that seem obvious or mere tools. As Julie Cohen, who works on some of the legal issues around technology rights, embodied and situated users interact with networked information technologies on a day-to-day basis, often turning those technologies to new purposes and adapting them in unexpected ways. So we've all spent decades teaching you that the medium is the message. It's not new, right? We can now remind you and ourselves that all of our digital tools, from Zotero to Twitter, to Moodle, to Emeka, from Facebook to Voyeur, to Neatline, to the iPad, all of these digital tools constitute that media, all of them. And if they seem fluid, invisible, smiley and blue, right, or simply a neutral means to another end, we should suspect that they are very well made, perhaps too well made, and prime for remaking and unmaking by our undergraduates. Thank you.
Questions?
I'll jump in. What is your expected proficiency level amongst the undergraduates that you work with in terms of the technology that you're using? And when I'm looking at the course that you developed, it looks to me like you may have to spend a lot of time outside of that course kind of developing those skills, and particularly the TEI and coding skills.
So it's a really important question, and I always feel the fraud speaking about digital technologies because I'm like the Luddite of digital technologies. So the bulk of the work that I do with students is pretty low tech in terms of what they have to learn to do it. So the TEI is an interesting question because we spent a good amount of time talking before the class about how much we really wanted them to know, what it meant for them to know. Did we want them to be able to be coders? So there's one kid in the class who's a computer scientist. We made him just crazy, right? Because he's like, you humanists, right? But we wanted them to understand coding just enough to understand coding, that it exists and that it becomes an interpretive model in its own right, and that they can learn a different kind of close reading through that. So what that meant, just nuts and bolts for the class, was we had 2 sessions outside of class that were 2 hours each. And that was with Jen. This would not have happened without Jen, and I point to that. But then in addition to that, the library, and this is why this is also important, held TEI office hours. So they had skilled up a couple of themselves in this arena. So my students already had the projects and already had the basics. So they weren't going to them just for kind of basic skills, but they said, You know, we want to think about humor, but we want to think about gestural humor. We can't figure out quite how to do this with the TEI. Like, how do we? And so then there was a kind of playful office hour between the groups and those TEI folks. So I believe that without them, I could have introduced the concept of coding, but the projects were pretty darn sophisticated that came out of this. And those were sophisticated because there were others with some of that skill set to do that work as well. So my answer is really a both and. My students are going to read all of Tristram Shandy in that class, right? And so I'm a believer in not overdoing technology in the classroom such that I can't do that kind of work of close reading and intellectual analysis in all of the ways I want to do that with and through technology. But one has to be very careful to calibrate then the different kinds of assignments to ensure that it's not overburdening students. And some of the students, they were doing a lot in this class. We talked about what one might pull back a little bit for the next round. But that really allows them to experiment in ways as well. So, yeah. Yes?
Have you ever used three-dimensional printers in some of your experimentation?
So it's funny you should ask this. We have one. This is on camera, so I have to be careful. We have one small three-dimensional printer on our campus right now that is in the sciences, right? And it sits there. I am in charge of a very major building project that I can't go into right now that will create new spaces around this. And one of the co-curricular seminars that we are hoping to run through Trico DH in the spring of next year will be called Critical Making. Right? And in many ways, it's come out of the work that I've been doing, the work that a computer scientist has been doing, the work that a sculptor has been doing, the work that a shapes mathematician has been doing, to start to think about how that kind of work could really build into the curriculum in a very trans-divisional way, and also hopefully working with some of the folks from our special collections who have art and artifact in those. So my smile is that it's absolutely essential to all of my conceptualization of the work and to the work that we're doing going forward. I mean, some of the most recent surveys on technology and what undergrad education will be is making. Now, what does this making mean? I think it can mean all sorts of things, but I think that there could be ways to bring that in, not because there's anything absolutely wonderful to fetishize about that, because at some point it's going to be the printer. Probably my child's school will have more 3D printers than we will soon. As you see, that's all happening in that kind of educational process. But I think it's going to become another component of education in our archive, and it's going to allow all of us, those of us especially who are in disciplines who haven't thought about that kind of materiality of making in quite those ways before, to really think about how that theoretically is going to, I think, loop back to our disciplines and allow us to think, to think about teaching a material, history of the book course with those capacities as well could be really exciting. Yes?
So it's interesting in your collaborations with the sculptor, in particular because you said he hadn't read Tristram Shandy before, right? So I'm wondering, did he sit in on the class and have these discussions with the students? And then when he sort of sketched out his design, how he wanted to approach this book, were those conversations that the students were contributing to?
So he's very interesting. The students were very troubled because Brian Detmer, the argument he makes about his work is that he does not preconceive it ahead of time. And that though he works with books, he does not work with them as texts in such a way that he understands where and how he's going to dig and what those pages look like before. So generally, he says he would never actually look through the book before he begins to carve it, that process of making is down. So he had to take a bit of a step back from that for our class because we demanded it. And basically, we had students who had read all of Tristram Shandy by the time he started working with us who were like, so where are you at? And he's like, so I'm doing the book on DVD, right, or tape or whatever it was. And they're like, what? And so they started to have all of these questions, and he actually was really interesting about the first many chapters of it he read, but there were all sorts of questions about whether his interpretive model was bankrupt, right, and what art means and what this text as art means versus the kind of reading that they're doing. So they then, in fact, talked about a number of the issues that were really important for them in the text and what they saw as kind of salient points. And when the work came into itself, and I wish I could bring it to show you, a number of them would look and say, oh, that's because of that comment, and that's, so they took ownership. He wouldn't give them that kind of ownership because that wasn't his model, but he also carved, which he'd done a couple of times before, but he carved in public. And he carved in our science center, actually, which was another version of this. And he sat and he did the work while people watched and asked him questions, and he talked while he carved as well. So it allowed us to think a little bit, too, about the kind of multi-sensory aspect of that making as well, and what it means to understand this as an art object differently, because we were all in on its production as well. Any questions from over here? I feel there's this bifurcation here. Clarification or things that were interesting or resonated? Anything in classes that you're doing that actually speaks to some of this? Why did you come? No, I'm interested in whether you were forced. We force our students to do a lot of things. So whether this was a class assignment or what it was that maybe seemed somewhat interesting or enticing. There was a hand up right here. Yeah.
I was just going to say that I like the way that the professors and things are like, it's like they're seeing that this is something that they want to like grasp and like apply to students and have students involved, because I feel like the only way to see it succeed and like grow and expand is if you have everyone involved, and I think it's like a great way to start. So.
Do you feel that there are ways that you're getting involved in some of that in classes here, like moments of that, or an assignment that you're like, yeah, that's kind of some of what we were doing with that?
One of my assignments in one of my English classes, we had to like go on Tumblr and like do posts and stuff like that, and interact like through like a website with students in our classes. So like it gave like people the experience of like understanding how people wrote in different aspects, and like people's more creative side of like the way of doing things. And I thought like that was pretty interesting, like just doing that instead of like sitting in a group and passing around a piece of paper and reading it. I just thought it was,
Yeah. Do you think I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you think you thought about Tumblr any differently after using
I never
it
used it
in class?
And then I haven't used it after the class.
Okay.
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 I'm more familiar with it now. So,
Right.
yeah.
There's another, yeah.
For my high school last year, we had to do, we were reading a Shakespeare play, and you had to make a fake Facebook for each of the characters in the Shakespeare play, and then it was like different groups to different characters, and then you talked to each other through like you made Facebook posts of something that they would say, kind of, but in more modern language, so you were kind of interpreting the text in your own way, and like kind of and using modern technology to do that. And you were also interacting with the other characters on like through Facebook.
Mm-hmm. So my question about that sounds really interesting. And I suspect it made the plays come to life in a different way for you?
Definitely. And it made interpreting it, it wasn't you just like sitting in class and being like, oh, this character, like you had to think about it on a deeper level because you were that character.
Mm-hmm. So while you were doing that, did you talk at all about Facebook? How it's put together, or whether your characters were all going to lose their privacy and their Shakespearean world because of that? Maybe not.
Not as much, but yeah, no, not really.
So, I mean, it's really helpful because I think what you've pointed to, and this is part of the work that Catherine Hales does, is the ways that these technologies can really enliven work in the classroom. And one of the things I'm trying to suggest is that that's great. And then if you could take it just to the next step, too, to say, now that we're using Facebook, let's read Facebook a little bit, too. And let's start to understand both why there's a kind of pleasure in this work that we're doing, but also what some of the other sides of, and I don't want to say darker sides, but what it is that allows this system to run in the ways that it does, and maybe how we could think about some of those issues of privacy and copyright. This is what you get to do in your junior class at University of Delaware instead of the high school class, right?
Yeah.
To then sort of say, how does this help us to think about like privacy or copyright or something differently? So that's, I mean, it's a really good example of part of what I'm suggesting, that it's great to have all of these technologies, to use them, but how much do we really know about them? And does it matter, right? So.
Oh,
Was
I
that-
actually just had a question. Did any of your characters get kicked off of Facebook for not being real people?
I don't know. After the project was over, like no one really signed on to them again. So they might be there, they may not.
Okay.
Well, I have a question, if I could. Okay, so if you get students to start looking at some of these and interrogating these technologies and deconstructing, as you put it, and I forget what the term you used.
Remediating,
Remediating,
remaking, right, making with them.
Then, suppose, have there been instances where they might turn that process around and start looking at their institution as an institution, the kind of technologies that are embedded there and what they commit and what they restrict and, start asking questions at that level?
I hope they do. So I will, it's interesting because since I'm teaching an 18th century course, I try not to get too, right, but let me tell you, but I am, and I want to do that because it's not just about interrogating our institutions of higher education, but it's about interrogating our cultural institutions around us, right? And so one example of this is that when we were reading Lessig, I had given them some chapters to read, but there are other really fascinating chapters on privacy and software. And so an example, and I'm trying to be very generic, but a student's computer was taken. And the student tried to start tracking that computer and discovered through working with IT that IT knew everywhere that student was with that computer and what that student had been doing with the computer at the time because the student was on this kind of system. That was brand new to our students, that the things that they understood to be private and those kinds of motions and movements weren't, right? And when we start working with things like iPads and the various kinds of apps and the various kinds of trays, all of those sorts of things, they start to ask all of those kinds of questions. Now, I think our institution hopes that they won't really become advocates until they leave, right, in terms of asking the questions of the institution. But my belief, really, and that was, I threw in that language of ethical, right, kind of ethical use of interface. But my belief for my own work is that we have an ethical responsibility to at least engage students in some of this work. And I introduce them to things like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and a variety of those things, because the other thing in my 18th century work is that it's all about these questions of censorship and privacy and ownership and capitalism and labor and all of those kinds of questions, which we've studied in that historical context. So because they have that context as well, they too, especially questions of labor, become really interesting for them in this work as well. So I don't have, if you looked at my syllabus, one of the students coded my syllabus. I'm going to bring that tomorrow for you to see. But there's not a sort of, let's look at the political implications in some ways, or let's look at the cultural implications as a unit unto itself. But the kind of work that we're reading and doing, and somebody like Galloway and somebody like Julie Cohen, who I mentioned, who's doing the kind of legal work on space and these issues, brings it out in them. Yeah.
What happens when you start with Hogarth rather than Tristram Shandy?
We definitely use Hogarth. So tell me about starting with Hogarth rather than...
Well, I think for many students, they're accustomed to thinking in terms of words, which often have stabilized meanings, but they're often not used to looking at the visual representations that Hogarth uses and interpreting those in the context of 18th century life and political and social meanings and ideological meanings that Hogarth imposes.
I think, imposing is interesting. I teach another course, which I will talk a little bit about tomorrow, called Spectacle and Spectatorship in 18th Century Culture, that really takes as some of the primary texts Hogarth, a few other artists, and aesthetic theory as well to think about that. But even in the texts like Tristram Shandy, there is a kind of model of illustration. And we also look at Tristram Shandy, and Jeremiah Mercurio, who is a librarian at Haverford, has done a lot of work on graphic text through the ages. And so we look at the various illustrated Tristram Shandys as well to think about visual, right, text alongside word text too. And there's a lot of work on that, especially in somebody like John's, who looks at what happens to various illustrations as they move between texts as well, and who actually owned those illustrations, who makes those choices and all of that. So that visual culture is actually part of this. One of the fascinating, for me, this is fascinating, questions around Tristram Shandy and coding Tristram Shandy, turning it into a digital text, is what do you do with the black page in Tristram Shandy? Because that is actually a graphic production. Well, the first thing you do is you look at various productions of Tristram Shandy in print culture over the years and discover that they've done various different things with the black page, leaving it out completely, you know, all of these sorts of things. And so, but there are real questions right now in the TEI, this markup, about what you do with that page and whether you treat that as the black page, right, and think of it in terms of language, or whether you try to mark it as illustration as well. So, yes?
I'm curious if you have any kind of nuts and bolts thoughts applying kind of the hesitancy of the slickness of interface, and perhaps in the course that you're talking about or in some other ways. You know, how do you document that in a way?
Yeah.
You know, what are you asking your students to do in terms of keeping track of the process of creation in such a way that then someone looking at the tool later can have a better grasp of what is actually being accomplished?
I'm not sure that this will answer the question fully in terms of those projects, because the tools were really kind of low-key. But in terms of the classes that I teach, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, for example, we use a variety of databases, 18th century databases. I don't know if any of you have used them yet. They're made by different companies of different nationalities. So we have Gale and we have Redux. So one of the things that we do is we spend time looking at Gale and Redux and the different search mechanisms, if you're looking at early American imprints and you're looking at some aspect of echo, and how the various categories that you can choose from and the way that those mark what has been tagged in certain ways has already created interpretive choices for us as people who are searching those databases. The ways that, you know, the most basic kinds of things about Boolean searches and the ways that one thinks about how fuzzy is the search, all of those things, what actually it looks like behind the screen they're looking at, and what that text is there, and how that scanning process has worked and functioned, some of the failures of that. One of the really great things about 18th Century Connect, they have a little, for those of you who are doing any historical work, they have something called Typewrite on there, and it allows students in classes to go in and actually correct a text in the Echo database to then understand that it isn't right anyway, and then they own it as a class. You actually get sort of licensed and you can use that. So for colleges that don't have the money to buy these various databases, what the professor will do is choose a small archive of those texts, have the students do that work, and then she can use those for classes going forward as well. But I do a number of those small assignments because what it then means, and I also, let's look at Google and the Google search, and when you're in this zip code and you're doing a Google search in this zip code, let's start doing those comparative search processes. Let's look at what Mozilla does. And so some of those things just come up in these very ad hoc ways. But with the 18th century materials, I'm pretty careful. We have a number of those assignments that really kind of demand that they understand how those searches function as well.
Yeah, the question, you already started to answer it just a second ago, actually. I really appreciate sort of thinking about the materiality that you were talking about of the technologies themselves. But I'm always curious, especially in sort of digital humanities conversations, about making the sense is that, if we teach somebody how to use a hammer and nails, then they'll understand sort of how houses work. Mm-hmm. And that then there's a payoff that then they'll be able to sort of go on and look at the next house and sort of think critically about that as an architect. Mm-hmm. And so I sometimes I wonder, and I'd be curious to hear how this sort of payoff works out for you.
So I will say with the utmost humility that I don't expect any proficient builders to come out of my class, like students who are really going to go build a full-on house that's not going to fall down on top of them. though there are students who are working across divisions who will become more sophisticated builders because they're taking my class. But what I think happens is that they do indeed understand the process of building, and they start to see that house differently, and they start to see every house differently. So for example, students, will talk about sort of having been in my class and then just going to a museum. I mean, it's analogical, but oh, so how do these structures of curation, right? I mean, something so simple as, oh, people chose those, and let's look at the wall text, and let's start thinking about the wall text and how that was put in place. And let's think about what it means that this wall text here is just sort of flat written text, and this is a video, and what does that video mean? Or going back to your point, I was in a store and these surveillance cameras, who uses what does that mean? And so part of it, I think, is a heightening of awareness for them. But then there are always the handful of students, and this depends on the programming. Delaware, I think, because you have an engineering program here and you have that kind of STEM capacity built in already, I think the fluidity of bridging between this humanities and that kind of work to really start thinking about design and prototypes. And we're thinking about that insofar as there may be students already in our computer sciences who can then learn some of these interpretive paradigms, but we're never going to do that on a grand scale because we don't have those programs. But for institutions that do, if you start to imagine what it would mean to have, to basically be team teaching a course in the humanities with computer scientists, which is what I'm hoping to do with this critical making thing. There's a computer scientist with whom I want to work. Then I think that the possibilities of really authentically offering those skill sets as skill sets at this undergrad level before moving to the next stage are there. But otherwise, I think that for me, it's the possibility of seeing differently, right? And starting, as we do with texts as well, but sort of seeing and saying, oh, what don't I see? Why don't I see it? What does it mean that I don't see that yet as well?
People might want to have a chance to ask Professor McGrane a question without the whole audience. So join me in just thanking her for being here.
Thank you.